We would start with doing some history so we can like sort of properly paint the picture. I was looking into your, sort of academic career and came across as though you got your undergraduate degree at Stanford in economics and a master's degree the same year. Is that accurate?
So Stanford has this weird thing. I arrived at college with a ridiculous number of college units from like while I was in high school. So I finished fairly quickly the undergrads, but I wanted to stay for a fourth year, and because I had some research interest and I had friends I wanted to say goodbye to. I stayed a fourth year and got my master's in econ before I headed off to med school. I mean, I was always going to be a doctor. Like econ was like a surprise to me. But when I arrived at Stanford, they make you take one of those general ed classes. And I took econ. I was like blown away. And it turns out it's really useful in medicine. Like the way the economists think, there's trade-offs all over the place in medicine, and people just don't realize what they are. And they don't think about them systematically the way economists do. So it turns out to be really useful discipline.
It seems as time goes on, it's more and more of interest and importance, right? And so you do get an MD in 97. So like we can be modest about your undergraduate career, but it actually just continues on. So I don't know if there's really any.
I mean, I was a student for a long time. After I was done with my undergrad, I was like 1990, I think. But then I got to med school and I really missed the research that I'd been doing in economics as an undergrad. And I wanted to do more of it. And so I applied to the PhD program. I really, really enjoyed my time in the PhD. Like the intellectual challenge, there's always like new questions to ask, new methods to learn. And medicine, it was until I started doing the clinical rotations, it was much less fun. There was a lot more emphasis on, memorizing vast amounts of information with very little time to ask why. And so for me, it gave me a way to explore my interests in, to basically learn how to be a scientist. And it had tremendous applications to medicine using this way of thinking, the statistical tools, but also the tools of like thinking systematically about trade-offs. That's really, really important in medicine. Doctors often don't appreciate. I mean, the best doctors do, but often intuitively. That's why you formalize it.
Because the schools of public health really didn't come about, right? And it sort of sounds like a lot of what you'd hope somebody would learn in a public health degree. But I mean, economics and medicine is sort of what you would hope public health would be, right? It's sort of the confluence of those two.
I don't really teach that in public health schools generally.
Really?
I think it's generally very inadequate. Even in medical schools, it's quite inadequate. And I think doctors really, 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 really should have much better training about how to read statistical work, much better training about how to think about trade-offs. They just don't. You can see it during the pandemic, right? Many of them were monomaniacally focused on one single thing, ignoring basically everything else about health. So better statistical training, better training about thinking about trade-offs, thinking about every single medicine you give as potentially having harms and benefits, asking questions about different groups.
All the risk reward stuff, right? Like
basic economics. It sounds like so trivial and easy if you've had some economic background. But in medicine, when the rubber hits the road, people often forget about it.
So one of the things that I was interested in was that in 2005, you're looking at healthcare costs in relation to obesity. And you're comparing the cohorts of people when it's private insurance covering somebody in the workplace, which is obviously more expensive if somebody's suffering from obesity and all the chronic illness that goes along with that. Who's covering that? How does it sort of funnel out? And how do you compare that to people who don't have the private? Do you remember this well enough?
I do. It's actually before COVID. It was one of my very, very favorite papers I ever wrote. And so the question was, who pays for obesity in health insurance plans? Because there were economists that were out there arguing at the time that if you have obese people and thin people in the same health insurance pool, that thin people in the pool, thin employees, are subsidizing obese employees because the obese employees have higher healthcare costs. If they're in the same pool, they're paying the same price for their health insurance, and yet the obese workers are using more.
I think that's logical. I mean, right.
Yeah, it's logical, but I think it's incomplete. There's a very famous paper in the 90s. What happened when the federal government mandated maternity benefits for female workers? It was really interesting. Basically what happened was that the wages of fertile age women went down roughly by the amount that it cost to pay for pregnancy.
Okay.
The wages of older women had no effect. The wages of men had no effect. It's a very strange thing. If you talk to HR people, they'll swear up and down, no, that can't possibly be.
And they're not going to like hearing that.
Yeah. And yet there it is in the data. So I asked myself, is it possible that you see this with obesity also? And so in the data, what you see is that in jobs with no health insurance, there's no difference in the wages between thin and obese workers after you adjust for education, job, occupation, and so on.
But those are likely lower skilled workers.
Yeah, these are generally worse jobs. They're not being offered any other things. But in jobs that do offer health insurance, you see this big gap where thin workers earn more than obese workers of similar education level, similar industry, occupation, so on.
I mean, that seems wildly unfair in a way, right? I mean, like, it's sort of hard to believe that that's true.
That's the thing. So it was a nationally representative survey. It's very carefully collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's just the data screaming at you. Here's what's happening. And then the story's even more complicated. It's a much bigger wage gap. This says for young men and women. It's like people in their 20s to their 50s. It's a large longitudinal survey representative of people who were 17 in 1979, and they tracked them for decades. They're still tracking them. And so what we found is that it was much bigger wage penalty for obese women relative to thin women compared to men. There's still a wage penalty for obese men, but much smaller than, and again, only in jobs that offer health insurance. And jobs that offer no health insurance, no penalty at all. And then if you compare like other job benefits that don't relate to health, childcare benefits, retirement benefits, that kind of thing, you don't see this asymmetry.
Wow. It's
only the jobs that offer health insurance, you see this big wage gap between obese and thin, and jobs that offer childcare, you see wage gaps for both. There's no asymmetry. So it's like the market somehow is penalizing obesity in the place where obesity would cost workers.
Yeah, it's almost like a correction, really. I mean, like, if you take the discriminatory element of it out of it, it's a correction for what you were looking to solve for in the first place, right? Is this a penalty on thin people who are paying excess of what they're spending?
Yeah.
Because they're subsidizing the obese people. And it sounds like, no, the obese people are covering their own costs.
Yeah, they're covering their own costs. That was a really surprising result. I didn't expect it. But again, there it is in the data. And you could see what happens over time. Essentially, the obese workers, they were much less likely to get raises over time. They're most likely to get promoted over time. It's still discrimination. You might think about this is that normally in a relatively well-functioning market, not that we have them, but like in a well-functioning market, what would happen is that if a firm discriminates against workers in this way, the firm would get punished because then it would like leave valuable human capital, like valuable people on the table unused. They'd underpay them, and people they leave for other jobs. I think that's what's happening for instance, in the markets, jobs that don't have health insurance.
Mm-hmm.
Firms that discriminate against obese workers, that get punished. But here, because obese workers do have higher healthcare costs, there's no punishment. And so they end up paying their own costs.
And so did you ever talk to HR people and say, you guys are discriminating? You don't realize?
They look at me like I'm crazy. And I don't know what to tell them. On the one hand, you have this nationally representative data set, and here's what the scientific evidence is saying. And then on the other hand, you have the real world experience of HR people. And there's disjunction between the two. I'm a scientist. I go with the national representative data, but like, I don't know.
Yeah. Again, it's interesting because you don't even think that the HR person is making a judgment based on what you're looking at. They're not thinking, oh, this person is going to go to the doctor more, or they're going to be more drain on the system.
And, I've seen this in lots of settings. Their results, for instance, the attractiveness of people is rewarded. Like physical attractiveness of people is rewarded, both men and women. Mm-hmm. Right? That discrimination doesn't belong in the market. It's terrible that it exists, but it's there. We shouldn't pretend like it isn't. And getting rid of it is a very challenging thing. Like if you just say you're not allowed to do this, other weird things happen to compensate.
Yep. Although I don't know, personally, I feel like, especially when I was younger, I would have been like, do a study on like blonde chicks and how they're discriminated against for not being smart, right? And like you can use that as a superpower once you learn to harness it. But it's like I wonder if there's a correction on some level with some of that.
I think like people are just bundles of prejudices. Like we have all kinds of prejudice in us. That's not abnormal. Our social interactions with people and markets, if they're functioning right, they basically give us feedback that those prejudices aren't useful. It's one of these things where like you want society to be a certain way, and then there's like how society actually is. And it's hard because like, you want to live in this world that's much more idealistic and just and right. And as a scientist, my job is to talk about how the science of the world as it is, rather than just exactly how the world I want to be. There's some conflation. There's like, oh yeah, Jay, you got that result, therefore you want the world to be this way. No, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on.
We'll get to the COVID stuff, but I feel like it's interesting to think about, some of this earlier work where you are sort of challenging some norms, right? You're thinking not, counterintuitively in a way, like you're looking at what is the real world? What are some bias? How do we measure these things? Really look at them and come to some conclusion. When you did that research, were you expecting there to be any change made in the marketplace, or was there any output beyond just you finding that finding?
There was a surprising amount of pushback to that paper, actually.
Oh, interesting.
I think partly because they just want to believe that the market could be working in that way. It's one of these things where you have a result and you tell the world about it and you see what the world does with it. And actually the world did nothing with it. It was really challenging to get published. The issue was this vastly, steeply increasing rate of obesity. Right. Back then it was a problem. Now it's like a super problem.
But also I think another point to make is that this is how things get conflated, right? Like your job isn't to come up with a solution to the problem.
I do want to come up with solutions so we can, but there's no obvious solution that comes out of this result. Any solution will have to account for this result. That's all. You're
exposing that there's a problem, right? Yeah. And then it's up to other people to do something with it. Because the other one that I wanted to make sure we talked about before we get into all the COVID stuff was your sugar sweetened beverage. So like soda, tax or ban. And that was around 2013 that you did that. But that was really interesting. And your results were pretty profound. So you were basically looking at people who are on SNAP or food assistance programs. What would happen if you made it so that you couldn't buy sugar sweetened beverages with that allocated money, or you subsidized fruit and vegetables? And you would potentially avert 510,000 diabetic years and 52 cardiac deaths over 10 years. That's really significant, right? But I also know what it's like to take on soda. And so,
I was not even taking on, we're just doing a calculation. I didn't know what the answer was going to be. But it's not surprising, right? In one sense, you have high rates of sugar intake causally linked to diabetes and obesity. And you have this environment where we subsidize sugary foods. You can see the rates of obesity in children just skyrocketing. And so the question is, what will the implications of that as these kids grow older? There was another paper of mine in a related topic. It was what happens if you have a high price of ground beef in a city? What you find is that cities that have a high price of ground beef, imagine you want to put a McDonald's tax in place. The poor kids have higher rates of anemia. Ground beef has iron, probably prevents anemia. Food is a very complicated thing. It's not like cigarettes. If I intervene in one way, I'm going to have unexpected effects in other ways, right? So maybe I'll reduce obesity, I don't know, but I may cause anemia in poor kids.
Yeah.
The sugar sweetened beverages thing, that one, it's relatively clean, right? Some colleagues of mine did this analysis of what happened when Mexico instituted this large soda tax. The people there, when the soda taxes went up, they substituted for the drinking water. You saw this little uptick in emergency room visits for GI bugs.
Because the alternative to the water was the soda, which they could no longer afford.
Yeah. Again, that wasn't an enormous effect, but there was a few that were on the margin affected that way. The other thing is you get these substitutions that in retrospect, you say, oh yeah, obviously, but in real time, maybe you don't. I don't know. I got frustrated, actually. That's why I stopped working on obesity. I kept wanting to find something that would actually make some difference. And every time I would do some research project, it would end up well, this doesn't work. Or some crazy finding that makes some people upset without actually having any impact on improving the lives of people.
And I think for me, some of my background in terms of the whole Broken Science initiative is really looking at how screwed up all of our, dietary guidelines and how corrupted that market is as a real, sort of test case, which we've now seen replicated in other areas, obviously. But interesting to think that you got frustrated with it because you couldn't find something that was, sort of like a silver bullet.
Well, I just felt like I was writing papers and find people who maybe get published in fancy places, but that's all that would happen. It just seemed, it was not very fulfilling.
Okay. So tell me more about that, because that's interesting. So it's your goal when you're younger is to get published. Now we're, 5 years out from the insurance obesity work. You're looking at sugar sweetened beverages, and you're driven more by impact. Is that fair to say?
If you talked to me in 2002, when I first became an assistant professor, I was pretty focused on getting papers out. If you're writing good papers, the world changes by great science. But I don't think that great science by itself changes the world. It has to be translated in ways that are meaningful to people. And something I didn't appreciate then that I much more appreciate now is that act of translation also requires creativity. It requires a great depth of knowledge, even more than some of the scientific work, right? It's a very different set of skills, but it's no less important.
Communication would be an example of that, right? Like how the narrative is presented and who's controlling it and what voices are allowed to speak or not. But I actually think in some ways, the combination of medicine and having an MD and also having a PhD in economics, I mean, so much of this stuff is really decided by money. And I think a lot of people in medicine don't have a complete awareness of that. Right.
If you'd asked me before the pandemic, it's not that I was unaware of it. Like, obviously, there were people that were writing papers that made no sense, and it was like they could have conflicts of interest or whatever. Right. And I would say that. But like, I never took any pharmaceutical money. I never took any industry money, in part because I wanted to be free of that temptation to fudge my work to fit some predetermined agenda. I mean, you can see like some of my work is
no, you don't go on any boards, it looks like. I mean, I don't know if you do now, but earlier on, you weren't on any boards. You weren't incredibly clean. I mean, almost like a unicorn, I feel like, when I was looking at your work. It's very different. No to
boards. You know, I don't care about money that much. Stanford pays me just fine. I can put my kids through school. I could do what I wanted. And what I really value is being able to say what I find without having to worry so much about, people coming after me. I don't mean to denigrate people that made different choices. I took NIH money. I mean, and the issue is like, is that corrupting? I don't think it's possibly completely clean. You do have to pay your salary in these kinds of things. And so I had, I had NIH money. That was the primary source of but in academics, that's seen as clean money.
Mm-hmm. When I first introduced you and Greg and we went to Nobu for lunch, one of the things that really has stayed with me from that conversation was you talking a little bit about how, as an all-star academic, you didn't call yourself that, but I will call you that, you sort of start out by wanting to get government grants and funding, and you're pitching novel ideas, you're coming up with things that you think that are worth funding, and then as you sort of get into the mill of it all, they start coming to you with ideas that they think you'd be great for doing, and how you were sort of having a postmortem on that part of your career and how things had changed for you in ways that you hadn't really, I mean, maybe you knew obviously at the time, but that you were reflecting on them in a different way. Can you explain that a little bit and just?
Sure. I mean, I think, so let's just stay with the NIH, the National Institute of Health, right? So the NIH has $45 billion of money that it gives to like vast numbers of biomedical scientists. The way it hands out the money is that you have to write proposals, and it's judged by your scientific peers. Something like 10 to 12% of the proposals that get sent to the NIH will actually receive some funding. I've sat on NIH review panels. It's a big coup. It's like basically a marker of success that you got the NIH to fund your work. And so it's not just that they fund your work so that you can do the experiments you want, write the papers you want. It's that they determine the social status of biomedical scientists. Stanford, for instance, has this unofficial thing in medicine that if you're not successful at NIH funding, it's very difficult to get tenure. It determines a lot. It's not just money. It's like social status inside biomedicine.
Well, and popularity probably, right? Like it's who you know.
If you're a reviewer on the NIH panel, grant reviewer, people are just scared of you. They're going to be much more careful with you. It's a lot of power, actually, within this tiny little world of academics, of course. But people care about that power.
I think it is really like somebody's academic career is broken or made based on a lot of these things, right? This sort of consensus, insular, who you know, how you're connected, are you playing the rules or not? Is that fair?
Absolutely. That's completely fair. A lot of academic life is you go to conferences to some extent to like learn about new ideas and hopefully be challenged. But a lot of it is you're trying to make sure that people remember you, that they see you, they can hear what ideas you're working on, so that when they get the paper, they're asked to review the paper or they're asked to review you for your tenure decision or for whatever else, they will be friendly to you. Again, I don't mean to be entirely cynical about this. I do think that there's some real relationships and real constructive things that come out of that. But there's certainly an element of that there. This sort of instrumental, I'm engaging in these activities simply because I want my career to advance, not because it's going to.
Right. I mean, It's not that dissimilar from every other industry. It's like the real world is obviously about networking and who you know and all that stuff. And you can try as much as you want to disclose your conflict of interests or your, try to absolve yourself from those kinds of things. But if you really like somebody and you think they're smart and you like hanging out with them in conferences, you're going to probably like their work better than some person you've never met. Right? I mean, that seems normal, right?
Yeah, it is. It's not just, Albert Einstein sitting alone in a patent office writing brilliant papers, and all of a sudden everyone recognizes he's right and changes the way they think, scientific world. And it's a very, very important part of what scientific messages bubble up to the top, who gets to decide about basic things. And it's underappreciated. At the beginning of the pandemic, I had to decide. It was really clear that I could stay in that old world if I wanted to. I would just have to be quiet.
So we fast forward to 2020. We have lockdowns, right? Stanford's shut down, but you kind of decide you're not going to stop working. And you do the Santa Clara survey, and you find that the numbers of people who have the antibody to COVID far exceeds that which the county is sort of claiming of number of people who have had it. And this is hugely important. I feel like, it's probably worth revisiting this a little bit, because we were getting sort of made up case numbers. We didn't really have a denominator. The death rate was, sort of unknown at that point. Yet there were these wild projections being made about the doom and gloom that was coming, and it was inevitable. And so the Santa Clara study is really a benchmark study in all of COVID, because very, very early, you guys presented evidence that challenged the conventional wisdom on what was being put out there publicly and what these projections were, sort of largely based on. And so, I think it was like Santa Clara County was claiming that there were 15,000 people who had been infected, and your work indicated that it was closer to 53,000 people had been infected. So a massive, massive difference. And you guys did that work. You collected those samples or processed all of that April 3rd and 4th of 2020. So this is in lockdowns. Everybody's in their homes with no toilet paper, and you guys are out there doing this work. And so I'm curious about, even before that, tell me about the origin of the Santa Clara study. You guys are aware that this thing is coming. Has Stanford come to you and asked you, or John Ioannidis, I can never say his name right, about whether or not you guys have opinions about this or thoughts on any of this? Are you involved in any of the decision-making process going on at the university?
Not at the university. So I remember in 2009, the H1N1 pandemic, there was this disjunction between what the death rates were reported in the early days of that pandemic. The death rates were really alarmingly high, reported by WHO, 3, 4, 5%. I forget the exact number, but it was really high. And then there was a whole series of seroprevalence studies of antibodies to H1N1 in the population that found that there were 100 people walking around with antibodies that no one knew had been infected or more. So the death rate went from the case fatality rate was 3 or 4%, went to 0.01%, 1 in 10,000 for H1N1.
Because they had to put all these people who were, not previously diagnosed.
Yeah. And the antibodies evidence doesn't lie. If you have antibodies specific to H1N1, that means you had it. That means you recovered from it. So I thought, okay, well, maybe that's true for this. Very clearly, obviously, a highly infectious disease, really impacting old people. You can see that in the Diamond Princess data, reports coming out of how it spreads. I forget exactly the date of the study, but it was I remember seeing it and being struck by it. One guy on one side of a restaurant in China, there's a fan blowing on him, and then a guy on the other side of the restaurant gets sick. Or that there was this big South Korean church where one guy has it, an 18,000 member church, and a whole bunch of people get it. So all these reports coming out that very clearly paints the picture of a very easily spread, highly infectious disease. And the death rate they're reporting is just like H1N1. 3.4% was the first WHO report. I had a little sense of deja vu. It's okay, this is H1N1 potentially again. We need to know as fast as we can. So I did something I'd never done before, which is I wrote an op-ed and I put it in the Wall Street Journal. So I wrote this op-ed basically making the case that we didn't know the death rate because we didn't have the denominator. We don't know if it's going to kill 200 million people or is it going to kill 20,000 people. And we need to have a seroprevalence study in order to resolve that uncertainty. And you can't make good decisions without that number. You needed that number.
Nobody was working on that. Can you explain that a little? That it does seem like such an obvious thing that you need.
I don't have an answer for you, Emily. When I wrote that, it was mid-March 2020. We just locked down. I'd had this argument with my boss, whose wife is the head of Santa Clara County Public Health, who locked down Santa Clara County from among the very first counties in the whole country to lock down. I also had in my mind like what was going to happen when we locked down, because I was going to kill lots and lots of poor people, right? You have this economic dislocation at scale, and what's going to happen is the lives of poor people depend on the economy functioning, the poorest especially. That was really, really clear to me also. So I had both of those thoughts in my head, and I figured the right thing to do is like try to do some science around this. I had the same exact thought you did. Why is the CDC not doing this? Why are they not measuring how widespread the disease is? That was the reason for the op-ed, was to go the CDC into doing this obvious study.
But also it was with the tests, it was the same thing. Like there was no sensitivity or specificity on the testing. And yet we were making claims about like how accurate it was. And it just seemed like it may be, but it also seems like you could just throw a dart at a board and pick a different number, and that would all go with that one too. Things were saying that they were predictive without the requirements you need in order to come up with an accurate prediction. And everybody was just supposed to get on board.
Yeah. Like March of 2020 was really interesting. All of the political types were like, they were in a frenzy over the lack of available tests. Now, the tests that we ultimately used for the study, which is measuring antibody levels, are different tests than measuring whether the virus is there in you. The tests that they used to see if the virus is in you back then was this PCR test. PCR, a polymerase chain reaction, is a test that amplifies the genetic material that's specific to the virus if it's there present in you. There's a thing called a polymerase that copies some genetic material. If you have one strand of it, it makes two. And then if you have two strands of it, it makes 4, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. It's going to very quickly get to a lot of copies, but you have to have that first strand there. The PCR test is developed, I think, early January 2020. I have no idea how they got out that. I mean, I have some idea, but let's just leave that aside. That's a different question. You have to make a decision about the sensitivity and specificity of these. It's a 1-0 thing. Are you infected or not?
Mm-hmm.
And if I start with basically nothing, and I start doubling, I should, in principle, should get nothing every time I double the amount of material there, right? Yes. So even if I double 40 times, I'm going to get nothing because I started with nothing. But, noise creeps in. And you can have people, for instance, that are recovered from the virus that have little fragments of the virus floating around them that aren't infectious, that aren't causing any trouble. And if I amplify enough times, I'll amplify even small amounts of the virus that pose a danger to nobody, not the patient that has it or anyone else. So I have to make a decision. How many times do I double before I call it? And it turns out that if you double it enough times, you're very often going to find people that pose no danger to anybody, but yet are positive.
Pop. Yeah, right.
Where do I do the cutoff? Do I double 20 times, and if it's negative after 20 times, then I should call it negative, right? No, I have to double up to 40. The philosophy of public health at that point was, let's find literally everybody who has it, isolate them.
Well, it's also interesting to compare that to something else like flu, right? And say like, well, if we tested everybody in every school every year on flu, how much flu would we have?
We apply the same policies as COVID. No one would come to work for 3 months.
Right.
There's lots of people with flu that just walking around. I think I have the flu right now because my son has it. And, anyway, so you have this like decision made that it's a virtue to catch every case. But in March of 2020, they don't have enough tests, because if you're negative one day, you could be positive the next day. It's not enough just to be not negative once and for all. It's like repeatedly you have to find if you're negative. A friend of mine wrote this piece in, I think, the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, calling for mass testing. And I thought it was just utterly naive. So what I was calling for in that Wall Street Journal piece, I was calling for measuring antibody levels in the population so we could understand how far the disease had already spread, and measuring the death rate from the disease.
Overall incidence rates, which we had no idea about.
Mm-hmm. So it seemed like an obvious thing to me. It didn't seem like particularly controversial. And yet when I wrote that, it completely changed my life. I started getting death threats. I started getting vicious attacks by people on campus. Because I have this background as a health economist, they're like, oh, why do you care so much about the economy rather than the lives of people? There's not one word about economics in that. I was actually calling to do regular science, right? And I don't think that the scientific community was ready to do regular science in March of 2020.
Let's just pause there for a second, because that's sort of wild, right? The majority of the scientific community wasn't ready to do science because they were what? Like emotionally unhinged? What was going on?
The common panic that affected basically almost every person on earth affected scientists at least as much. And the idea that a scientific result might lead to a change in policy that threaten the lives of scientists? What if I'm wrong? You lift the lockdowns and now scientists have to go to work and they face the threat of the virus.
Meaning like just showing up at your job, not working on the problem.
Yeah. For a lot of scientists, the idea that you should ask this question certainly was a threat.
It feels to me like, as an outsider, like everybody's so sensitive that you can't challenge this, you can't ask this question. We all know that scientific progress happens when things are challenged, right? And conventional norms or wisdom or whatever is supplanted by a novel idea or some experiment or instrument or person. And so, I mean, I get on the level of, I'm Fauci, I don't want anybody challenging my ideas because I'm really a political figure. Okay. I mean, I feel this way about artists too. Like, it was really surprising to me that we didn't have more artists saying like, wait, what? You're taking away our freedom of speech and our freedom of assembly. And like, we're not going to have a protest or, you know, do some art around this. All of that was a real lesson to me. I mean, as somebody who knew there was this level of health corruption and, you know, all the stuff that I'd been looking at for a long time, it would, the public response still bothers me that there weren't more, you know, people standing up and sort of saying, wait a minute, like, let's figure this out. Like, that's cool. You did this policy because you thought that was the right thing to do. And at the time, based on the limited information you had, like, great. But we need to actually now spend some time unpacking this and figuring out if it's right or not so that we can make best decisions moving forward, right? That's so logical.
I mean, what you just described is an idealized version of science. It's just not asking of questions and testing of ideas. But the problem is, like, you know, scientists are human and we're subject to the same kinds of biases that regular people are. So, for instance, a lot of what public health did to enforce the lockdown was informal. Told the public that if you go out, you are not just placing yourself at risk, but you're placing at risk the lives of countless other people. There's this sense of like, if I ask a question that will stop the lockdown, then people might think that the disease is not that serious. They will go out. They won't abide by the lockdown. That enforcement of the lockdown by changing the minds of people. I mean, you know, the data on the age stratified risk was very clear by March of 2020. Young people had very low risk from this. And, you know, remember the Rudy Gobert, the NBA player, he got COVID, I think it was like early March. And he does this like press conference where he doesn't take it seriously. And they went after him viciously. They wanted to make sure that young people thought it was really high risk or else they wouldn't comply.
But I feel like AIDS was always communicated to everybody as though like this could happen to anybody, right? That like gay rates and heterosexual rates are the same. And we obviously now know that's not the case at all, you know, and I don't want to like get too tangential and have any meaning, but it's like the idea of like pregnant women drinking, like the recommendation that women who are pregnant not a glass of wine has been explained to me that it's because like you don't want a woman who's an alcoholic thinking it's okay. So we just say no to everybody, almost like infantilizing by saying like, we're going to put a blanket over everybody and we're not going to decipher between groups because we just need total compliance.
Economist named Emily Oster, who got in a lot of trouble for making that argument, was brave during the pandemic also, although she got attacked for that bravery. The premise was that if you don't tell heterosexuals that they're at risk, then homosexual interactions will be stigmatized. And so it's a virtue to do this, even though the data don't support it. You saw this with monkeypox, for instance. Like the public health authorities were very, very reluctant to say the thing that was coming out of the data and that monkeypox thing that happened 2022. It was promiscuous gay men that were spreading it, not anybody else, really.
And so, I mean, that's such a like bastardization of science. It's you're taking something that's clinically found, right? Data-driven, empirical, and you're applying some sort of like mores and values to how we can communicate this so that we don't offend people. And it waters it down and makes it meaningless so that people are like, don't believe anything that you say because what you said before about that was totally wrong and not applicable to me. And I was really scared.
The thing we're like talking around is science has been used for the stigmatization and destruction of the lives of tremendous numbers of people. Mm-hmm. The 20th century is not a good century for this. Like we have this like, you know, scientists actively participating in the eugenics movement or justifying racial discrimination on the back of like terrible science, but they called it in the name of science. They did this, right? Or the Nazi doctors who did ridiculous experiments violating human rights at scale. I mean, we have to be very careful about asking some of these questions, like just simply because there is a social background to this. You have to be aware of that. For instance, if I wanted to go test a nuclear bomb, that is not a scientific question I should be allowed to ask. There are social constraints to what scientists can and can't ask. I'm okay with that. That's completely reasonable, right?
IRB approval kind of stuff, right? Like that feels a little different to me than finding a result and accurately reporting it.
You're right. I have like pre-approval to make sure that what I'm doing is ethical and all that, respecting human subjects and so on. And then on the other side of it, once you have the result, how do you convey it? Right. That's what public health is about. Mm-hmm. You have to. Scientific debates are often complicated. You have to simplify. That's just a necessity in communication. You have to like make decisions about, okay, which parts of this do I emphasize, which parts do I don't? How can I convey the gist of it fairly without getting into the weeds? That's normal. Public health, what they often end up doing, and I think this is really just counterproductive, in order to not allow science to be used to stigmatize and discriminate against people or harm people, they will lie. So I think that those kinds of ethical messages are absolutely part of public health, but they shouldn't lie. You can convey it in a way that is less likely to result in stigmatization and harm, but you have to still convey the truth.
I think it's insanely offensive when somebody lies to you because they think that you can't handle the information or the truth, right?
Well, I mean, it's infantilizing, and they think so little of the public, right? If you were to tell the public, okay, grandma is at risk from COVID, here's what the data show. Your kids are not really at risk. We don't want to tell you how to live your life, but when COVID is spreading, be careful around grandma. Instead of treating people like adults and telling people honest truths, they call them noble lies, right? They will deceive the public in order to manipulate the public into doing what they want. So predictable is that when people realize they've been manipulated, they will be very angry at you and they will not trust you even when you're saying true things.
That's right. That's my point, is like you're making a value judgment about like, we're not going to offend anybody. So we're going to lie and then nobody will ever believe us again and we'll be completely ineffective. Let's get back to the COVID stuff just for like in more specific detail. So, I mean, you have the Santa Clara study comes out. It gets a significant amount of attention because it does show that there's this huge discrepancy in what the data is versus what the data is purported to be. And then like, things start sort of upticking, but there is a general awareness, maybe not the average American, but there is an awareness that this is definitely a lot of old people are dying, right? We're sending sick old people back to the nursing home and it's not having a good outcome. But there are also a lot of stories, and I remember really taking some of them apart about kids that were just complete fabrications, right? Where and I started to see this all the time, where you've seen relative risk being reported and there's no mention of absolute risk being, less than 0.01%. And that was infuriating. So, I mean, at this point, are you starting to see a little bit more of this is a noble lie, right? Or there is something happening here that's a lot larger than just us not getting this right or doubling down because we had these policies? Like, where is your awareness around all of this? I guess maybe before we get into what happened with Scott Atlas at Stanford.
At this point, what happened was after we wrote the Santa Clara study, the med school asked me to stop talking to the press. They didn't call it an investigation. They called it a fact finding.
This is like your peers.
My bosses, the head of the dean of the medical school. There's like a false allegation in BuzzFeed News claiming that we'd taken $5,000 from the head of JetBlue. I mean, it was ridiculous, right? So the JetBlue founder gives $5,000 to Stanford to offset the operating costs of the study. We ran the study for like $100,000. I forget exactly, but it was really cheap. One of my colleagues, who is currently the head of the interim head of medicine, she got a $13 million grant from the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation to run a seroprevalence study that was supposed to have results in December 2020. That they didn't get results out until late into 2021.
Much larger study or similar cohort?
We actually recruited more people than she did in 2 days than she did in 15 months. It was very, very clearly an attempt to try to get me to stop talking. I'd never had anything like this happen to me before. I had to hire a lawyer to just advise me on the process. It was really stressful. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. There were hit pieces in the newspaper, like BuzzFeed News, on my wife. I was worried for my family. Like, the whole thing was just really, really stressful.
When you were told not to talk to the media, was it a sympathetic, like, hey, we're kind of in this weird space right now, we need you to just lay off? Or was it really like, hey, you can't do this anymore, like you're going to be in big trouble?
I just told them to go away. because I told them I'm a tenured faculty. I have academic freedom. You're not allowed to tell me that. But no, it was not a sympathetic, friendly thing. They were coming after me. They're coming after my job. They're coming after my reputation. And the Scott Atlas stuff was right around this time too, like July 2020. Scott is a colleague of mine. We got to be really good friends starting in April because I presented the Santa Clara study, and then he asked great questions, and I hit it off. And we're sharing papers, daily. Unlike me, I had no media experience at all before the pandemic. A completely new world to me, right? But Scott had a lot of experience with that. And so he's on Fox all the time. I guess he got caught President Trump's attention with one of his appearances, and then President Trump asked him to be his advisor in mid-July 2020. From the moment he got to the White House, he's calling me up saying, Fauci, Deborah Birx, they're not listening to the data. They're not interested in the data. They have their own idea that the pandemic needs to get stopped with these lockdowns, and they're not interested in any other data-driven message. It was frustrating to hear him talk that he was being marginalized, even though the president had invited him to be his advisor.
He was saying that he actually credits you with keeping him there, that he would call you and he'd say, like, I'm out of here. Like, nobody's interested.
He wanted to quit.
And he was like, Jay would be like, you've got to stay. You can't.
He had to stay. I mean, like, there's at least one sane person advising the president of the United States. I honor him. Like, the bravery of that man is just so he's getting attacked by the Washington Post, the New York Times. They're all saying nasty things about him. And these are all stories essentially placed by people like Fauci and Birx. They want to destroy him.
And then there's a letter circulated at Stanford.
Circulates a petition. It's an open letter that's sent to everyone but knew not to send it to me, I guess. But my friends tell me about it. Basically, what it says is Scott is a danger to the public. It insinuated, without directly saying, that he was opposed to hand washing, which was a total lie. Even on masks, he was recommending masks for workers in nursing homes because he wanted to reduce the risk to people who are the most vulnerable.
No specific examples of anything. I mean, there was nothing tangible in there. No evidence per se.
Scott is Scott. So sometimes he'll be on TV and he'll say something in a very, very forceful way. And so the idea that a prominent person of the Stanford faculty could then go advise President Trump, that really set a lot of people off.
His belief was when you're called to serve, it doesn't matter who the president is. It doesn't matter if you voted for him or not, that it's your duty as an American citizen to go and serve your country, that he was thinking about it as serving the country and not so much about serving Trump per se, though obviously knowing that was the White House that he was being called into.
That's exactly what Scott told me before he headed to the White House. He was doing it because he was seeing the direction of health policy, of public health policy, moving in a way that was destroying the lives of poor people, of children. And he wanted to do whatever he could to try to address that. So the dean of the medical school passes a letter around, a tendentious letter that doesn't actually have any real substance in it. And a couple of junior people actually called me up and told me they felt pressured to sign it.
We were talking about earlier, it's like it's who you know and who you get along with, right? So you want tenure, and you've got your advisor saying to you, "Hey, you got to sign this thing." It's really hard not to.
Yeah, and then they bring it up to the faculty senate. The faculty senate votes. And I don't have another word for it, although they didn't use this word, but that is what it is. They voted to excommunicate him from Stanford. They couldn't fire him, but they excommunicated him morally. For a long time, it was the front page of the Stanford Medical School webpage was that letter vilifying Scott. It destroyed him. Yeah. It destroyed his reputation. It made it so that he was not unable to be effective in his job, which was advising the president for rational policy. These were not people, most of them were not like epidemiologists or economists, or they were like people who had no expertise at all in this kind of public health policy. They'd never advised government officials like Scott had. They didn't understand the trade-offs. They didn't understand any of the intricacies. They just thought that Scott went to advise Trump and it was besmirching the Stanford name, that he was giving advice that was contrary to what public health said. They just signed the letter. It's
hard to understand on some level. And then on the other side of it, it is sort of like all these other cancel culture things where it's a stoning. And you just think like, if I don't sign, I'm going to be the next target. And I don't want that. So self-preservation kicks in and you do what you think you need to do. But at this point, you must have some idea that like there's a target on your back too. I think it happened while that the Stanford fact finding on the Santa Clara study was still ongoing. At first, I was so angry at Stanford. I was like, I don't care if I'm going to go find a job elsewhere. I mean, I've been here for 37 years, Emily, and it's home to me. I love this place.
And I was so disappointed with the leadership that I felt like they had destroyed the basic foundation of this place. I mean, I don't know, but my friends talked me out of leaving. They were like, no, Jay, you got to stay and fight. They said, well, just take a year to decide before you go. I applied some places, but ultimately, I think they were right. It's better that I stay and fight.
And so the Great Barrington Declaration comes around shortly thereafter.
Yeah, July, early August, this crazy fact-finding thing clears me of all wrongdoing.
Okay.
They clear me, but then in the letter clearing me, they have this like poison pill where they're like accusing me of, because I ran the Santa Clara study, I might have violated California law.
Why? When
you have an antibody test and you find somebody that's positive for antibodies, the insinuation is that there's a law in California that says that if you're a clinical lab that runs testing on infectious diseases, you have to report evidence of having that disease within an hour to public health. First of all, we're not a clinical lab, we're a research lab. Second, we had an antibody test, which is not evidence of an active disease. Third, we actually had the cooperation of Santa Clara Public Health. They knew what the results were within an hour. And yet in this letter, they're like, oh, there are lessons learned all across. You're a faculty in good standing, but here's some possible lessons. And like one of them was like, might have violated the law.
Wow.
Criminal statute.
I mean, that's threatening.
I mean, it was just really clear. The message they were sending is, Jay, if you're quiet, you can go back to your career and everything will be fine. If you keep talking, we're going to play hardball with you. I was like watching what was happening around in the poor countries of the world. I was watching what was happening with Scott. President Larry Arnn of Hillsdale College, he called me up and asked me if I'd be willing to write an affidavit because he wanted to hold graduation for the Hillsdale kids. And so I went to the CDC page. They had a thing on how to hold mass gatherings during a pandemic. I just copied that, put it in an affidavit. And they sent me this video of the Hillsdale kids having graduation. The Stanford kids didn't have a graduation. I mean, I was almost in tears. Like we basically denied all these kids a real meaningful moment in their lives. I'm teaching classes where I'm not allowed to give finals. It's all on Zoom. I felt like I was frauding the kids because I couldn't really give them a contribution to a Stanford education because it was this hollow Zoom thing. I got pretty good reviews, but still, it's just not right.
It's a different experience, no doubt, right?
I just was like, okay, if I have to lose my career, I'll lose my reputation. At least I can look myself in the face. Like I have an obligation to this that I've committed myself to.
Did you talk to your family about it when you were thinking it through?
My wife was more anti-lockdown than me. She was like, Jay, you're not doing enough.
Getting back to the Great Barrington Declaration. So like Martin Kulldorff at this point is at Harvard still. Has he been kicked out or no?
No.
And Sinatra's at Collateral, or she hasn't done Collateral Global yet, but she's at Oxford.
Martin is still at Harvard then, faculty in good standing. Sinatra is still at Oxford, and she's a professor. I'd met her in summer because I'd given this Zoom talk in New Zealand where she also gave a talk. She reached out to me. I'm like in awe of her just generally. She's like an accomplished novelist as well as being one of the best epidemiologists in the world. And Martin, I had not met him before the pandemic, but I had used his statistical work in some of the FDA safety surveillance work that I'd done. He's an incredible biostatistician. The reason he's at Harvard. And we met actually at the foot of the White House. Scott, one of his main goals was to like get Martin and me and some other scientists in front of the president. Fauci and Birx blocked it for months. Finally, in August, it happens. And that's where I meet Martin for the first time in person, August 2020. We hit it off. Like we had this long walk back to our hotel, and it was like, we're just kindred spirits. We're brothers now. He and I like write op-eds. So he calls me up in late September. He's like, Jay, we're trying to organize a meeting between journalists and scientists where scientists can talk to journalists and tell them about the epidemiology of the disease. And so he's like, can you come to Massachusetts to have this conference? And I'm like, sure. And he's like, then, I got Sinatra to agree to come. Then I'm like, oh, yeah, of course I'll come. Yeah. And of course, no one's flying at this point. It's like early October 2020. The whole thing just felt like it was this surreal thing where the entire world is shut down and I'm traveling in order to have this scientific conference. There's some journalists there. We talk to them, but we talk to each other primarily. And we're like, well, why don't we write something about what the strategy we should be followed is? And that's how the Great Barrington Declaration came out. The ideas are old as the hills, right? Don't lock down, protect vulnerable people. Those are the two basic ideas of the calls for action for the Declaration.
We now know, right, that this hurts old people, not young people. These policies are going to hurt young people. Right? This is not even controversial anymore that we know this. And yet when you guys wrote it, it was hugely controversial to the point where I actually found an article that was less than a week later talking about how Google was redirecting searches to all the negative stories. So if you search Great Barrington Declaration because you wanted to read it, Google was moving you over to things saying like, oh, this is a piece of garbage. These are these conspiracy theorists, right? You have Collins and Fauci emailing each other saying that there needs to be like swift, aggressive action or whatever the words are that they use.
Devastating takedown.
Devastating takedown. I mean, and that you guys are some like fringe epidemiologists.
So a friend of mine sent me this card. Look, it says fringe epidemiologist right there at the bottom.
Oh, that's a perfect title.
The head of the NIH called me a fringe epidemiologist. Not very many people have this honor. Same time, NIH is funding me, right? For
I think there's just two other people in the whole world that have that
that honor. And the devastating takedown. I mean, like the action by Google to essentially to shadow ban and highlight and defame the Great Barrington Declaration. I don't think that was an accident.
I don't think we have any doubt about that. I mean, I think your case, right, Biden v. Missouri, will show that. But I think, or has already.
It has shown that. I mean, it's documented, and 4 federal judges have like looked at the record just in horror. Barrington's case showed that.
The CDC stuff with Naomi Wolf showed that.
This was an all-of-government approach to try to suppress the critics of public health policy. A few months later, in March of 2021, I was in this roundtable with Ron DeSantis where I said that there's no good evidence for child masking. YouTube censors the video of a sitting governor talking to scientific advisors that then informs his policy so that people can't understand what basis he's making these policies on.
If you had told me 5 years ago that something like this could happen, I would have laughed you out of the room. I would have been like, no way, the media is not going to do that. Like, no one's going to fall for that. I mean, do you think like when the Fauci Collins email, obviously that came out later, but it was 3 days or so after you guys published the Great Barrington Declaration. And I don't know them personally, so I can't analyze it really properly, but it almost feels like tongue in cheek.
There's a history here. And if you look at some of the other Floyd emails, you can get a clear idea of this history, right? So the HIV era, there was a very prominent scientist named Duisberg, I forget his first name, who had the theory that HIV doesn't cause AIDS. This is in a time before the PCR test is available. There was some reason behind his, I mean, you see Berkeley professor, the brightest folks in molecular biology and immunology. He makes a thing saying, we don't have enough evidence to say HIV causes AIDS. It's like 1984 or 5 or 6. I forget exactly when. For Fauci, Duisberg was his enemy. Fauci's strategy is, now that we identified the virus, let's get a vaccine that guards against the virus. And if Duisberg is right, that strategy is going to lead to problems because you have a vaccine to HIV, but then you might still get AIDS because it's caused by some other source. And then inventor of the PCR test, Kerry Mullis, comes in and says, you know, Duisberg might be right. This is like, again, late 80s, I think. And so like you have a powerful muscle, like very, very prominent people countering Fauci. Now, in that fight, I think Fauci was right. HIV certainly causes AIDS. Like, I don't think there's any doubt about that now. But at the time, I mean, if very, very prominent scientists like that disagree with Fauci on this, there must have been some scientific reason based on the evidence that was known at the time that was reasonable to have this discussion. For Fauci, he destroyed Duisberg, made sure he never got another NIH grant. He destroyed the reputation of this Nobel Prize-winning scientist, not just any Nobel Prize-winning scientist. Kerry Mullis, who invented the PCR test, probably the most important advance in molecular biology until like CRISPR. And so you had this like power in the hands of this man who used it to crush scientific opposition to him in the name of public health.
In the same way by like weaponizing the media, or did he do that by going to UC Berkeley and convincing them to?
All of the above.
So same playbook.
Same playbook. He did this, by the way, with the lab leak, right? So when the idea of the lab leak comes out in January 2020, you basically see him organizing a cover-up in these FOIA emails where he deploys the press, not just destroy the reputations of people who think it, or to co-opt people who think it into his camp, right? He also then creates the idea and spreads it through his like allies in the press saying it's a racist conspiracy theory to say it's a lab leak. He just uses the same playbook to destroy the reputations of people who disagree with him scientifically over and over and over.
Times like health reporter or science reporter like happily tweeted out that anybody who talks
they want access to Fauci. If you get on his bad side, you're not going to have access to him. And then all of a sudden you're not going to be quite as prominent as a science reporter, right?
Yes, but I also think like that's not why you go into that business. It's not to make friends with your sources.
Well, that's not why you would go into that business, Emily.
Right. Truth to power. I mean, that's what it used to be about. And you have to manage that. I'm not trying to like be naive to that. You have to manage your need for access, but you are also such an important part of their piece, that's okay for there to be tension.
Yeah.
In fact, it has to be. Otherwise, you're not doing your job.
Yeah, I think the most prominent reporters in this country that cover the COVID pandemic, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they're very, very friendly. It's basically hagiographic treatment of Fauci. Can't think of a single instance where they actually challenge him.
Which I feel like they should be fired for. I mean,
40 years in power, that's a tremendous amount of power that he has.
Tremendous amount of money for funding. He and Collins, I mean, I think that was one of the big things that I learned through all of this that actually did surprise me, was that you could have literally just two people who control almost all government funding for research.
Or biomedical sciences, yeah.
Biomedical science, I mean, like, that's it, yeah. Right? And then, so if you don't follow along with them, I think that's a huge pressure point and a huge conflict of interest. If you're controlling all the funding and giving out all the grants, you should not be also making policy. That seems like church and state.
Absolutely. Like, those should be separate, right? It's a conflict of interest. And, there are private sources of funding for biomedical sciences, but, they coordinate with the NIH. The Gates Foundation is a good example of this. They basically, the priorities of the NIH and the Gates Foundation are very, very, very close. They have this leverage over the minds of a tremendous number of scientists. I think you just have to not allow that kind of centralization of power to happen. You have to decentralize it.
Okay, so we have the Great Barrington Declaration. You're sort of in your year of thinking of whether you're going to stay at Stanford or not. You've realized you cannot remain quiet. It's just not an option for you. The environment at Stanford has not improved at all. And then you find out, or somehow it's brought to your attention, that there is a secret petition being circulated by Melissa Bondi, who's the chair of epidemiology. And she's trying to get you silenced, even though the med school's already tried to silence you and it hasn't really worked, right?
Let's fast forward. This is March of 2021. I'm in this public roundtable with Governor DeSantis. And I prepared for this roundtable by looking up the literature on child masking. And there is no randomized study, not a single randomized study on child masking and COVID. If you told a human subject committee, I'm going to mask up these children and see what it does, they would laugh you out of the room. They'd say, look, this is a human subject violation. Why are you masking a toddler?
It's a moral violation on so many levels that you couldn't do the study. So instead, you just decide to implement it as a policy.
Yeah, they just implement it as a policy at scale. So when the governor asked me if there's any good evidence in favor of child masking in terms of controlling the spread of the disease, I had to tell him no, because there are no randomized studies for whatever reason. That led 100 of my colleagues, one of them, suspect I know, but I won't name because I don't know for certain that she wrote a petition to the president of the university, quoting me from that roundtable. This is like September 2021, and saying, look, there are faculty that are spreading dangerous public health messages, and quoting me from that roundtable and calling on the president to silence the faculty that are acting in this nefarious way. And the chair of epidemiology circulated the petition to all of the Department of Epidemiology, and 100 of my colleagues signed the letter. Again, a couple of them leaked the letter to me, so I knew it was coming. Several of them told me that they felt compelled to sign it because you get the chair of the department saying, sign it. But at that point, this is September 2021, I was much more media savvy than I was and resilient. Once I made that decision that I was going to let my reputation go where it will, all the anxiety had lifted. So all the death threats and all that still coming in, it's just not creating the same kind of anxiety as it did in 2020. So what I did is I asked a couple of my colleagues, Martin at Harvard and Carl Hennigan at Oxford, to write a defense of the scientific statement I'd made. And that was easy, I imagine, because there are no randomized trials. I was right about that.
And that's the other thing that's sort of interesting, right? Is you look at this from okay, I'm going to sign this or not, but I want to watch what he said. They actually couldn't watch it because YouTube had removed it. I mean, that's another part that I think is interesting that often it gets left out of this as a story, is that there was
the censorship makes it
this or that because it wasn't available. It was gone.
Yeah. And then the other thing I did is I had a bunch of media contacts by then and reached out to my reporter friends. I told them about this story and they got all excited and they called the president of the university and asked him if he was planning to censor me. And Stanford nominally supports academic freedom. So of course he had to say no publicly, effectively rebuking the people who wrote the letter. The letter hadn't yet been delivered to him, I think. That was actually quite satisfying.
Getting ahead of the game.
Well, I was channeling you, Emily. I'm like, okay, what would a crisis communicator do in this situation?
That's exactly right. That's the play. Get ahead of them. What's their next step? But it is hard. The emotional stuff. I mean, we've talked about this privately, but I think this sort of arc of feeling devastated, feeling lost, feeling lonely, feeling like, who am I? Everybody's saying I'm this horrible person, but I don't think I was. And I still think I'm doing the right thing. I think ultimately becomes the most liberating experience of most people's lives, because you lose the garbage friends that weren't really your friends in the first place, right? You have sympathy for the people who were not able to defend you, but love you anyway, because they're so scared. And God forbid you wouldn't want to live a life like that either, right? And you can have empathy towards them in some capacity and know what their limitations are in a way that you didn't before. And all of your dirty secrets have been exposed, right? Like if there was something they had on you, it's out there. So you get to stand up and just be free to speak your mind in a way that you really can't before you've gone through a crisis like that. I don't think it's completely possible. We all have voices in our head saying, don't say that, or you might look funny, or that's going to piss off this person who you need to be aligned with. And it's not that you're not savvy in that way now, but I think you have a totally different perspective once you've been through something like this.
No, I'm freer now than I've ever been in my life. There's no question about that. The crucible, like going through that very, very difficult time, set me free. Yeah, I'll always thank God for it, because there's no other way to get to this point. Partly, like, for even the people that did really terrible things, my philosophy has been to try to forgive them, in part because my faith calls me to, but also in part because I think that a lot of them were acting out of fear. I think that kind of fear doesn't reveal people. It masks people who they really are. It turns them into monsters when they're not actually monsters.
The first Brownstone dinner, which was what? Like, was that 2021?
Yeah, I think it's 2021.
And I've told the story 100 times, and I don't know who he was, but we were at a pretty small gathering, and we ate dinner together. And I was sort of lamenting to him all the people that I had in my life who I thought were brilliant, that I've now realized like can't critically think, and that like that's been a reckoning for me, and just sort of some of the social, angst that I felt about people really feeling strongly about things, and you're not supposed to talk about them, and you have to be polite, and I'm not good at that. He sort of was the one who explained to me in this very easy way that I think he's absolutely right. Like the people in that room would have probably not survived, right? A couple 100 years ago. We have evolved to get along. We haven't evolved to like stand up to the chief or to challenge the authority in some way. And that if everybody was challenging authority, we would have total chaos. I've come to think about, this is a lot of what this show is about, is sort of like my exploration of like really good critical thinkers, and like, where does it come from? And why do you decide to stand up in moments where you're called to on some level, but it's not in your interest, right? It's almost like a genetic defect that you have this impulse to stand up for something that's right. You're far safer hiding in the crowd. He explained that to me in a way that I thought it really did enlighten me. And it made me realize like, I shouldn't be expecting everybody to be like me. That's A, not fair. And B, like they're playing it safe and I'm willing to take this risk. That's a choice in some capacity. In some people more than in others, obviously.
I agree with you. Like holding people to our own standards of ethics or morality or whatever is not right, actually. You'll end up being judgmental about everybody and your relationships will get killed, right? That kind of forgiveness is a really constructive thing. And of course, we're always more willing to look at other people's sins than ours. So it's not like I'm clean. But the other aspect of that is like, could I have just stayed quiet? I don't think I could have, Emily. What happened to me in 2020, that path I went down, it put me in a place where I had to decide what was the purpose of my career. What was the purpose of my life? Why do I even have this job? There's no purpose in this job if it's just self-aggrandizement. It turns out it's a tremendously powerful job, but you have to use the power the right way. And if you use the power just to move ahead up the greasy pole of the scientific establishment, it's a total waste.
I do think if your job is to, it's sort of like the noble lie. It's like, that's not why you got into it, right? And so it's counterproductive for you to fall in line when you're told to, if what you're seeing is egregious or wrong, or you have a knowledge or experience in some way that informs something that you think could be of public interest, right?
Especially for me, I'm an immigrant. I came to this country when I was 4. My mom grew up in a Calcutta slum, and my dad was a brilliant man. He was a rocket scientist. When he first came to the country, he couldn't find a job, so he worked at McDonald's for a year. I lived in a housing project from like age 4 to 11. So I don't take it for granted that I have this job. It's an amazing country that allows a child of an immigrant to have these kinds of opportunities. But the purpose isn't to move myself up the ranks. If that's all this job is about, then there's no purpose in it. And so when in 2020, that question essentially got asked by Stanford, like, why do I want this job? What's it for? I was tremendously anxious to lose this position, obviously in early 2020. The false accusations really hurt. about conflicts of interest and so on, especially since I've been pretty fastidious about rejecting industry. So that hurt. But like ultimately, none of that really matters. What matters is, are you using the gifts you have for a real purpose, for the well-being of others, especially the most vulnerable? There's really no other way to be fulfilled other than that.
And it's gifts and power.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't know what power I had until the crucible came. I went on Twitter, and it turns out the Biden administration put me on a blacklist the day I joined.
I saw that. I was like, did I have this right? I was thinking the same month or the same week. You joined Twitter.
The day I joined.
Then you're immediately on a blacklist. So it's like you don't have a horrible history of offensive tweets that you've been warned about. It's like upon joining, you're targeted.
I joined Twitter in August of 2021 because Martin, they placed some label on one of his absolutely 100% correct tweets. And Martin was worried that GBD wouldn't have a voice on Twitter if he got kicked off. So he's like, yeah, you got to get on Twitter. I'll help you get an audience. Actually, it was pretty, I got 10, 15, 20, 30,000 people almost immediately the day I joined.
Well, it's because the rest of them were like, oh, wait, who's this guy who's getting blocked? He must be interesting. I want to know who he is.
At first, I was like, okay, I'm just going to share scientific studies. And so if you look at my early Twitter, I shared the Great Barrington Declaration and then just some scientific studies. Like, I'm kind of timid about Twitter. I didn't know what the power of it was. Yeah, but I got put on a blacklist. I asked the Twitter engineer to figure out when I was first put on. It's like, turns out the day I joined. And my crime was sharing a link to the Great Barrington Declaration. I tried to get verified. Back then the blue check was like you were part of the establishment. And I'm a Stanford professor. I should have been verified. The Great Barrington Declaration, I was in the news. I was on media all the time. But they didn't verify me. They refused me because I wasn't notable enough.
It's because they didn't want you getting noticed. That's why.
Yeah.
So
because of the blacklist.
This is sort of like an interesting segue into the court case, because obviously those documents at Twitter, this isn't hearsay. It's not Elon Musk claiming that there's somebody there. This is all part of a massive docket. And it was just this last summer that a federal judge basically said that if this, the stuff in the case, which it looks like is all true and whatever that he had seen was accurate, that it would be the most massive attack against free speech in the United States' history. And so you're a plaintiff in this case, and the Supreme Court has agreed to hear it. But they have backtracked a lot on a lot of the sort of, I don't know what to call them, sanctions that they had imposed on interactions between government officials and tech companies, specifically social media and Google and search engine type places. And the judge in July, who I loved, wrote several pages naming individual people in the government who had intimidated or pressured or whatever social media company executives or folks to censor people. And so it's interesting because this has now gone through two other stages and the Supreme Court's going to hear it, but they've basically said until, we hear the case, we're not going to impose these limitations on those officials. And I think it's important to point out that the backstory on that is really important in that, if a crime is committed, right, or if there's some sort of really terrible thing that's shown, it is important for law enforcement, particularly, to be able to go and make social media companies take down postings. And that I think that's the justification for a lot of this. Now, what you guys were censored for was there was no crime, right? There was no accusation of crime. There was no even public accusation of anything. It was all done behind closed doors. So that's quite different, but I think it's important to express those two.
The Louisiana judge, Terry Dowdy, who issued the original ruling on July 4th, he was sending a message. What he wrote was, this is an Orwellian ministry of truth. Because the evidentiary record that we had established based on essentially discovery of emails, long depositions of people like Tony Fauci inside the government, the Surgeon General's office, the CDC.
By the way, I'm going to link to that testimony. Fauci testifies for, it's 7 hours or something. It's a lot of time. And it's only been viewed 4,000 times.
He says, I don't recall, to basic scientific questions, 179 times in the context of that interview or that deposition under oath. We have this evidentiary record where you have the Biden administration and agencies of the federal government going to social media companies saying, these are the people we want you to censor. These are the ideas we want you to censor. Take these things down. And if they don't comply, the implied threat, and sometimes the explicit threat, is that they will destroy the companies. They'll regulate them out of existence. So the companies generally comply. There's pushback, but for the most part, they just comply.
Well, so I sorry for Broken Science about Section 230 and how it's like sort of become this whole thing that is a huge piece of leverage for the government against social media companies. And I'm sure you're familiar with this, but we had a lot of people in our sort of little community of, low carb diet, keto influencers that were not able to have, like, their big YouTube channels with millions of viewers were being taken down because in August, YouTube decided they were going to defer to, we saw this during COVID where they deferred to the WHO, but now they're deferring to the American Academy of Dietetics or, the American Medical Association, other local authorities that it can be the arbiter of truth. And I think that's, it's horrible, but it is also because they're trying to get around the Section 230 threat. And so they can defer to another authority and then they're sort of out of it.
Yeah. That's the easiest thing for social media companies to do. The CDC comes your way and says, anyone that says there's immunity after COVID recovery is misinforming the public. What do? Push back? You don't have any scientific ability to push back. So you just say, fine, we'll take all those posts down. That's exactly what happened. The government abused its regulatory authority in order to intimidate social media companies at scale. Some social media companies, they wanted, for political reasons or whatever, to go along. But I think the primary actor was the government. Which
is illegal. I think it's important to say this. The U.S. government is not allowed to censor its citizens.
That is what the issue in Missouri versus Biden is. Is it illegal in the country for that to happen? The case itself will be heard over the course of years, and there's going to be court trial will happen. But on July 4th, the Louisiana judge issued an order to the Biden administration telling them they were not allowed to go threaten social media companies to censor. It had exceptions. For instance, it allowed the Biden administration to go and tell them that there's criminal activity happening on a platform, things that everyone agree ought not be on those platforms. That it didn't restrict that at all.
Mm-hmm.
But in addition to that, it also told the Biden administration that it could not outsource the creation of a hit list for censorship to private organizations, like the Stanford Observatory, for instance, which is a collaborative that works not too far from my office. And what they do is they use machine learning and AI algorithms to try to identify who is spreading what they deem to be misinformation at scale, including true things like there's immunity after COVID recovery, for instance. And then they go tell social media companies to censor those things. The government then says you should censor the things that are on the Stanford Internet Observatory's list. So the government uses these third parties to launder the defamation of people and to censor at scale. Missouri versus Biden judge said in July 4th that the government isn't directly allowed to go and threaten media companies to censor. And also they're not allowed to use cutout third parties like the Stanford Internet Observatory to censor. He said that the reason he issued a preliminary injunction even before the trial is completed is that we're likely to succeed on the merits and that the violation of the First Amendment, there's no remedy. 1 second of violation of the First Amendment is an irreparable harm. And so the Biden administration needed to cease doing it immediately. Then there was an appeal to the Fifth Circuit then agreed with the trial judge that there was this vast censorship enterprise because they read the evidentiary record and there's no other way to read it. And they agreed with the trial judge that there should be a preliminary injunction ordering the Biden administration to not order the social media companies to censor. But they didn't agree with the trial judge about the use of third parties. They didn't keep the preliminary injunction for that. The Supreme Court stayed the injunction pending hearing the case. And so we're going to have a hearing, I think, in the early spring.
Are you excited?
I can't wait.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you was, in all of this, what is something that you feel like is knowable but isn't known yet, whether it's in this case or just the whole COVID drama?
There's a lot I still want to accomplish, and much more now than I did before the pandemic. I want to make sure that these lockdowns and the kind of public health infrastructure that allowed them to happen never happens again. And I want to reform science. And the fact that I have a potential to contribute to that conversation is really amazing. It's a real privilege. And I'm looking forward to the next few years just for that.
Yeah. And I think that's going to be the most important work of your career, right? No doubt. Preventing something like this from happening again and exposing all that happened is an important job. And I think it's desperately needed, more so than we've had it so far. So if you could design an experiment right now with let's say we can freeze time and you can have as much money as you want, what would you do?
I don't really need an experiment for what I want to do. I want to reform public health pretty fundamentally. I want to decentralize funding decisions so that a small number of people, 2 people or whatever, does not have the kind of control over the minds of scientists that they had. I want to make ethical prohibitions in place so that people see that there's a conflict of interest between people who control scientific funding and people who contribute to like policy making. So there's like changes, I think, at the NIH. The FDA is captured by pharmaceutical companies, and we need a thorough revision of the agency so that doesn't happen anymore. Like right now, I think 60% of the funding is actually from pharmaceutical companies for the evaluation of drug products.
I actually would have thought it was more than that, but
it could be higher. I mean, I never looked at the latest numbers, but
I mean, like a lot of the peer review editor, like of the high impact journals, right? Like JAMA, BMJ, New England Journal of Medicine, have all had editors over the last decade screaming to anybody who would listen that like we've got a huge problem with conflict of interest. We have a huge problem with the way that research is done. We have a huge, I mean, we can talk about p-values, right? Like we have all of these problems that, you know, Richard Smith has probably gone the farthest by saying that like we should just assume that most research wasn't actually even done that we're publishing. So it's interesting because I feel strongly that COVID was sort of a gift in the sense that it brought a lot more attention to science and to the problems of science. But as far as the problems in terms of policy or federal regulation or these agencies, I mean, it's been around forever and it's caused tons of damage. And a lot of people in power have tried really hard to call attention to it. And yet we still had it get a lot worse with COVID. So what sort of recommendations or suggestions or, you know, how are you thinking about tackling this problem? And also, more importantly, like, how do you inspire younger people to take some of this on? Because I think that's going to be the key.
I think the younger people, we harmed them with these decisions at scale, and they know it too. They're still feeling the after effects of it. They'll want these reforms. There'll be a great number of young people that will be motivated in coming years to want this reform. We talked about some of them, like the NIH, the FDA. The CDC is really interesting, right? So the CDC, the way it deploys power, here it's non-peer-reviewed journal, creating science that supports its policy recommendations rather than asking scientific questions that ask whether their policy recommendations are right. There's a really close connection in the CDC between the scientific work they do and the policy work they do. That needs to be divided.
You know, Greg sued them for their conflict of interest stuff.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
He sued the CDC because he found out that the CDC had a foundation that didn't have any conflict of interest charter. So private companies can give money to the CDC foundation, and then that's earmarked and given to researchers. None of that was being disclosed, and he won. But I don't think that they ever actually like changed their ways.
I knew the CDC Foundation. I knew about the conflict. I didn't know that Greg had sued them. That's really great. That kind of funding shouldn't happen. Like it should just be public money that supports that public work, right? The other thing about the CDC is that there's a second way that they use power, they deploy power, is that they make these guidance. They say, well, we recommend that you mask your toddler. And then preschools around the country say, oh, you're forced to mask your toddlers. Mm-hmm. And if they're questioned, they say, well, the CDC made us do it. Well, the CDC didn't make them do it. They're following the recommendation of the CDC. Like I was involved in a lawsuit as an expert in Santa Clara County, where Santa Clara County had ordered in 2020, you were not allowed to have in-home Bible studies. Two families meeting together violated the social distancing rules or whatever, the bubble rules. Ultimately, on the Supreme Court, we won that case, right? But the CDC guidance on social distancing, the courts gave a lot of deference to it. It's a freaking guidance, not a law.
One of the things that I was really interested in during all of this was how the public health officials, right, like the Department of Health in your local, county or whatever, like they had more power than the governor all of the sudden, and they're not elected. Like it seemed to completely circumnavigate all of the balance of powers that we have built into government in a way. Is that partly a chain from CDC down? Is that how that worked?
Yeah, I mean, the de facto power they have is tremendous, even if they're not formally given it, right? That needs to get defanged, right? If they're going to have that kind of power, they should have the same kind of constraints on that kind of power that other regulatory agencies have. They have to go through the Federal Register to they have to put it in public comment. They have to go through the normal process for making a regulation if they actually will have a de facto regulation that has the force of law.
Obvious, right?
Yeah. I mean, the principle is you want separation of powers. I think that's a very wise principle. And basically every aspect of the public health response failed in part because there wasn't adequate oversight and separation of powers in decision making. It's concentration of power. And I think that that's the key idea in the reform is to like devolve the power out of the hands of relatively few people into the hands of many people, and allow there to be much more public oversight before these decisions get made.
I mean, by dispersing the power, right, then you end up having a situation where it's much harder to have the level of, corruption, collusion, whatever you want to call it, where you have this sort of consensus cycle that's happening that's not based on any real evidence or empirical knowledge or outside influence or dissenting opinion or any of those things that we would definitely say are necessary when, especially in the scientific world, but probably in all aspects of making decisions that impact people.
Absolutely. Like Tony Fauci was the de facto president of the United States for at least a year and a half, unelected. I think he undermined 2 presidencies.
Naomi, who said to me, it's really odd the way that he looks at Trump and talks to Trump. And she was sort of saying that when she was working in the White House, so like, even if you didn't agree, like there was this level of respect he wasn't showing.
Well, I mean, you can see who the alpha dog in that room was. It wasn't Trump.
Right. So I have kept you way longer than I thought I would, and we could keep talking. But is there anything else that you had wanted us to talk about that we haven't touched on? Or I know you're doing some interesting stuff. Are you working on dementia stuff?
That was part of my career before. I work on dementia. I put in a couple of NIH grants to work dementia, which got rejected during the pandemic. The idea is that the scientific field of dementia research has got stuck in a corner, focused on the amyloid hypothesis. And we have a mechanism of identifying promising novel ideas. The research is focused on how to identify novel ideas and how to structure incentives in scientific decision-making to allow those novel ideas to be tested. And even when there's a huge dominant paradigm that has in its interest their paradigm not get overturned. For dementia, it's a really good application of this idea because the amyloid hypothesis has seen some very high-profile failures in terms of the drugs it's produced of late. And people are now, their minds are now open that maybe there's something else going on.
Well, and there was the Science magazine piece that I was sort of obsessed with that came out showing a lot of that benchmark research was photoshopped.
Back when I was in medical school, what we were told is that you diagnose Alzheimer's after the patient has died at autopsy. That's the only way you can find amyloid in the brain. And so a lot of the research since then has been focused on imaging to try to find amyloid without having to do a biopsy of the brain after the person's died. And then to design drugs to target the development of amyloid plaques on the theory that amyloid plaques are the cause of the clinical dysfunction, the loss of memory, the characterized dementia.
Rather than a potential symptom of something else, right?
It might just be incidental, right? It might be that there are other processes and you lose your memory and you get amyloid plaques. It's the other processes that are driving it. So who knows? My mind is now open to this.
You're familiar with Dale Bredesen's work or no?
No.
I'll send you some stuff on him. He's really interesting. And he was really charged up to come up with a drug and then realized that it's multifactorial. So he had more than one variable to test. And his theory is that it's inflammatory. But when I was really doing my work on women's health, 2/3 of Alzheimer's patients are female, right? And people used to say it was just because women lived longer. But that didn't really make sense because the onset wasn't after the average age of death for a male. So there were a lot of inconsistencies, and it's now become clear that it must have some interplay post-menopause with hormones and brain function. But anyway, I'm going to let you go. But thank you for giving me all the time, and I'd love to talk to you again.
Really fun to talk, Emily. I'm sad that it took so long for us to get together to talk this way. Well, it's nice to see you.
Thank you, Jay. Bye.